All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming and joining us. We have these really nice bird songs going today. It's a great way to start off our Green Living seminar. I'm Dr. Elena Traister in the Environmental Studies Department here at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. And as you probably know very well by now, this semester's Green Living seminar is organized around the theme Nature and Spirituality. These presentations are always free and open to the public. They take place on Wednesdays at 5:30 here in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation, room 121. You can find the schedule to our series and another couple of upcoming presentations at our website, www.mcla.edu/greenliving. And before I introduce our speaker tonight, make a quick announcement for you guys to come back again next week on Wednesday, April 15th. We have Sam King. He's the project manager for Journey of the Universe. He'll be presenting a talk titled The Call of the Ecozoic, Religions Enter Their Planetary Phase. Today's presentation, titled How Laws Protecting Birds Strengthen Human Communities, will be given by Meredith Barges, Chair of Lights Out Central New York and PhD student at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Her dissertation combines policy theory and environmental ethics to examine the dynamics driving the adoption and non-adoption of mandatory municipal bird-friendly building practices across the U.S. and Canadian cities. From 2024 to 2026, she founded and chaired Lights Out Central New York, a nonprofit project of Onondaga Audubon dedicated to making the night sky safer for migratory birds. She previously co-chaired and co-founded Lights Out Connecticut, where she helped lead a successful statewide effort to pass Connecticut's Lights Out law. She also served as policy researcher for the Yale Bird-Friendly Building Initiative. She holds a Master of Divinity in Religion and Ecology from Yale Divinity School and an MA in American History from the University of Chicago. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So I'm going to be talking, getting started this evening by making a claim that I think many of you will likely agree with. And that is that bird life is vital to human well-being, and because of this, for us to thrive, we need to think about birds in all of our decision-making about how we live on the land and how we live with the land. Study after study shows that experiences of birds in connecting with nature are essential to human well-being and to human health. Even brief everyday encounters with birds, like we just heard birdsong, even though we didn't have birds in this room, but we could tell a difference that when we were hearing birds around us, when we walk down the street and we hear a bird like a robin singing, if we watch sparrows fly across an open field, we could notice a black-capped chickadee feeding on a coneflower. All of these experiences actually measurably reduce our stress levels. And there is a lot of science coming out. There's almost seems like there's a new study every month showing that seeing birds, hearing birds, noticing birds reduces stress, improves our mental health. It improves, it can also be a cognitive reset. So if you've been on the computer for a long time, then you just step outside and you hear bird songs for a little while. It's like hitting a reset button. It also improves our observational skills, and that these benefits can occur in everyday spaces. They happen in our own backyards. They happen on the street. They happen, in parks, any green space, any place where you go where you can see birds, you could have this experience of experience of like really wonder, a joy, and just like an upliftment. The bird songs, and that's suggested by the fact that we co-evolved with birds. Birds indicate to us where is a safe place. If you hear birds singing, likely there's no predators around, and there's likely clean water and different things that us as humans that we need, and so birds became indicators to us of a safe place. So when we hear birdsong, it triggers something in us that actually improves our mood and makes us feel relaxed. Yet, despite our deep biological and emotional and even our spiritual connection to birds, we typically do not think about them when we make decisions about when we make decisions about our buildings, when we make decisions about zoning and different things. And the result of that is that today, birds in North America are experiencing major population declines. The news that keeps coming out year after year, either at the state level or at the national level, is that birds are just disappearing from the landscape. So in the last 50 years, we have lost 3 billion birds from the landscape. That's just total from any one moment in time. We've lost almost 3 billion birds. That's 1 in 4 birds are just gone from the landscape. And there's a lot of reasons why this trends are happening, but it's happening almost in every state into almost all species. There's only like a third of bird species that aren't being affected, and those are the ones that are more opportunistic, like crows or something like. But the majority of birds are experiencing major population declines. And it's very worrying for bird conservationists, and that's why Audubon's major trend campaign right now is to reverse the curve and to bring bird populations back. But we make decisions about where we live and where we study, where we play, where we sleep, without thinking about birds as part of the design, without thinking about birds as part of planning or our zoning codes. And this has had real serious consequences for birds and bird communities. The threats to birds that in the past were more like from direct human action, so from something like hunting, where that's one of the reasons why the passenger pigeon went extinct in 1913 is overhunting, or from things like commercial trade, so they would capture birds and use their feathers in like the hat trade, or there was a lot of collecting nests. There was a lot of competition to collect fancy bird nests, and so there was a lot of direct human actions. But today's sources of mortality for birds are really from indirect. We're not making choices to intentionally harm birds, but the consequences of our choices are that birds are harmed. And the numbers are really staggering of what the consequences are when we make choices without thinking about the consequences for birds. Many billions of birds are killed annually around the world because of bird building collisions. This is where birds briefly mistake a reflection on the glass for habitat or from another member of their species, and they'll crash into the glass and actually live 2 blocks from where this building, which is the Circa on the edge of Central Park, this building went up so glassy right next to Central Park, and they find these dead birds and beautiful migratory birds. I don't know if any of you had a parula or a black and white, but these are beautiful birds they're migrating thousands of miles to make it to the forests in Canada to nest, and they happen to, for a moment, encounter some glass and crash and die. And the statistic is every single year, at least 1 billion birds, and maybe as many as 2 billion birds, die just from glass. But other forms of development that we humans undertake also cause bird deaths, including things like wind turbines, outdoor pets, a lot of feline predation, green lawns. These are some of the numbers, and these might even be underestimates of some of the different choices, even like pesticides that we use on lawns, or even rodenticides. So there's those black boxes that you see near buildings. Those are to control rodent populations. And then what happens is owls and even like a bald eagle could eat that poisoned rat and then die secondarily. So a lot of the choices that we make, we're not intending to kill birds. That's not the point. That's not the purpose of all of the choices that are happening here. But all of these human choices end up causing bird mortality, and the problem is that, you know, a good argument could be made that it's not just because at the top of the line here it says habitat destruction, but actually all of these, I would consider all of these forms of habitat destruction, because the truth is that the places where birds can safely the places where birds can safely live out their lives are shrinking. They're being poisoned. They're being polluted, and it's really like as a byproduct of human decisions. And as I said, the root of this deadly trajectory for birds is the failure at nearly all levels of human planning and decision-making to meaningfully consider birds and other wildlife as regular and vital members of the land community. And that's a really expression from Aldo Leopold. If you've read his work, he's really powerful. But he talks about a land community that we're all just members, and there's no one particular member that's more important than another. We have to know our place in the land community, and by not thinking of other members of the land community, we end up making choices that harm the community and harms members. The result has been the physical extirpation or erasure of birds from many human-settled areas, with hundreds of bird species either no longer found in urbanized areas or only found in very reduced numbers. As I said, these are the kinds of opportunities that we could have to either ignore birds and build the kind of glassy buildings and use pesticides and things that could harm birds, or where we have opportunities where we can make other choices that could support bird life. But I would argue that the physical extirpation of birds followed the imaginative extirpation of birds from the way that we understand human-settled areas. When we think about a human-settled area, whether that's a city, a suburb, a peri-suburb, or even some rural areas that have like little village centers, we don't think about birds as part of those human-settled areas. And therefore, birds have been removed from those landscapes. We have made choices that make it so that birds can't live among us in safe and healthy ways. And that's really birds as a consequence of birds being removed from the way that we imagine the places where we live and where we work. We just can't imagine that birds would live alongside us. And so they're not a part of how we imagine the buildings that we build or the towns that we plan. And as a result of this, cities, which are intense places where even more, they're intensive, concentrated places of human settlement, we almost think of them as biodiversity sacrifice zones. I don't know if you've heard that term of a sacrifice zone, but it's an area where you just don't expect it anymore. We don't even expect to find wildlife in cities. We think of cities as just places where maybe you might see a pigeon, which are an invasive or an introduced species. You might see, rats or cockroaches. We think of the animals in cities mostly as pests, but actually, most of our cities around the world are in places of very rich biodiversity because they're usually coastal or they're at a place on a river because of commerce. And so these are places where traditionally, historically, birds and other wildlife lived in really rich, high numbers. And now, these cities have become places that are human-only zones, and so we almost think of them as like sacrifice zones. Stephen Keller, who is a professor at the Yale School of Forestry, where your professor went, he's written a lot on the idea of the living city, and he wrote a book called Building for Life, and he has this diagnosis. We can read it. It's sort of a longer. This was all one set of lines, but we can look at them together as he's really doing a critique of the way that we do, in particular, urban development. He says that the prevailing paradigm of urban development is neither necessary nor is it sustainable, and it constitutes more a design deficiency than an intrinsic and inevitable flaw of modern life. These tendencies have collectively encouraged many to believe that the benefits of contemporary society depend on massively exploiting, if not conquering, the natural world, and that progress and civilization have been equated with humanity's distance from and subjugation from nature. So really that we think of progress, we think of cities as places of progress. So what does progress look like? A glassy building, cars everywhere. That's how we imagine progress, but that actually distances us from nature and also subjugates nature. It puts nature to work for us instead of us living in harmony with nature. So this makes me wonder, how do you imagine progress? How would you define progress in civilization? And what do you think a city should look like? Should it be a highly developed, tightly controlled place where only humans live and without any consideration of wildlife? Or could a city or a suburban space be a living place where people and wildlife can live together? And that's really the central question, is can we coexist and can we live together with wildlife in safe ways in human settled areas, in the places where we live? Despite all of the obstacles that we have placed in birds' paths, birds remain persistent inhabitants of urban areas. Today, you can still find Baltimore Orioles nesting in Central Park, as I have seen those nests, oyster catchers in Boston Harbor, and American woodcocks preening in Chicago's Montrose Point, but not in their same historical numbers, but you can still find birds in urban places. And I believe that in the pursuit of the good, we should undertake a public project to imaginatively rewild our human settled areas, to imaginatively rewild birds back into the places where we live, as a way to reverse those population declines and also for our own benefit. It would also create a physical rewilding of birds, and it would be a reinvigoration of human wellness. Science indicates that the places where birds can thrive are places where we thrive. And so this would be a way to really build on that meaningful connection we have with bird life. And there's actually, over the last, this is my idea of this imaginative rewilding. It's a place where if we imaginatively rewild cities, it means that we reimagine our relationship with birds as enriching and co-constitutive of a good life. Jennifer Walsh developed the concept of a zoopolis to propose a new ecological vision for the city that does not alienate us from animals. So she has this idea of like animals should be welcomed back into the city. I would make the point that they have to be welcomed back in safe ways, but she has a real concept of the zoopolis that many have used. And also the writer who came up with the idea of nature deficit disorder, Louvre is his name, he also offers the concept of the symbiocene city to describe a city where humans and wildlife can live together, signifying a living beside. Part of this work is also reimagining cities themselves. So not only do we have to reimagine our relationship to birds, but we have to really reimagine what a city is. So you have a really great quote here from Timothy Beatley, who's he's the director of the Biophilic Cities Network, and he goes around the world promoting the concept of a biophilic city, which is cities that are filled with life, filled with plant life, filled with animal life. And that's really a guiding ethos for all of the planning that happens in those cities. From Singapore, Arlington County is a biophilic city. And so he says, we need to overcome our perceptual bias. It's our own perceptual bias that cities are biologically and biophysically impoverished places. And here you have an image of a bald eagle and a gull flying. They're just flying through the city. The cities are filled with wildlife still, just not in the same numbers. But we have to remember that actually many of the places where cities are vital habitat for birds. There's no doubt that with millions of migratory birds flying through urbanized areas and human settlements every spring migration, cities remain vitally important places for birds and for bird conservation. And as resource-rich places, cities also have a number of tools that can be cultivated towards helping us to imaginatively rewild our human-settled areas. And these include things like educational reform, so that young people growing up in schools or at any level of education really, that they have an appreciation for birds. That's kind of part of the curriculum. Or having urban bird festivals like they do in Chicago, and they're having one in Vancouver in a couple weeks. Using science to make decisions about whether or not we build or what the building designs are. And also just recognizing for public health, recognizing our interdependence with birds and what value they bring to human life. Foremost among all efforts to reverse the physical and imaginative extirpation of birds from human-built areas, and almost as a prerequisite, is cultivating a new ethical orientation towards birds and biodiversity in the city based on coexistence. And that's a word, you know, when we think about coexistence, a lot of times it's in sort of like in a peacemaking or, you know, peace negotiation is, can you have peaceful coexistence between two groups of people? But people are using that concept also for the human-wildlife communities. Is, can we have peaceful coexistence between us where we respect both, you know, while we respect wildlife communities or bird communities, and then vice versa, is that we don't have like too much encroachment where it's unsafe for us either. So can we have a good balance between these two, with these two communities living together? Helpful to this is that idea of the zoopolis, which I mentioned before. And also because new technologies are constantly being deployed and created, like the large sheet glass that causes hazards for birds, or these new black rodenticide boxes. New technologies are constantly coming about that they're not intended to harm birds, but a lot of times they can. And so what you almost need is a driving ethos. You need to have an ethic. The city and the city planners and the city government needs to have an ethical orientation towards wildlife and bird life so that it can guide all decision making, whether that's about a single building or that's about where a road goes or whether they're allowed for clear cutting. There needs to be an underlying ethic of care for birds that guides all of the decision making. And so that is almost like a prerequisite for all of this kind of rewilding of a city, is to have this kind of an ethical orientation towards birds. And I would say that would be more important than to having one single policy. You need to have a guiding ethos that guides all decision making, and then to also work at the deeper level of changing people's values and attitudes towards birds. As I said, because imaginative rewilding cities is no less than reimagining cities as vital habitat for birds and for wildlife. So a project of imaginatively rewilding birds in human-built spaces could start with something as simple as bird lovers, you know, helping people to see, hear, and notice the birds around them, and to reimagine the city as a biodiverse living place in ways that are meaningful for people and that promote holistic community well-being. This kind of a project wouldn't rest on one approach or one profession. It would need people with all different kinds of skill sets and all different kinds of interests, from scientists and advocates to educators to artists to lawyers to city leaders, all of together working to expand a vision of a bird-friendly city. And evidence of this kind of work can already be found. These are photographs of Audubon's bird mural project, where they painted murals of different locally local birds that are experiencing population threats due to climate change. And so they painted these beautiful murals, like here's a Baltimore oriole, there's a red-headed woodpecker, which is endangered. So they painted all these beautiful murals all over the city. Mostly they get from the Bronx, they've got them in Queens. And these are a way to remind neighbors about birds that are transiting through New York City, because all of these birds are found in New York City. And that care needs to happen for these birds, that these birds really need our care. So these beautiful birds are found. They're all different sizes, and it's and they actually take people out on walks to go look at the murals and then talk about what the different threats are to birds. But as part of this project of rewilding, every city would need to plan and design their own bird conservation efforts based on the local needs and local preferences. The emphasis should be on retaining and celebrating the local particularities of the place, its unique ecology, or what's called a vernacular knowledge, or the local knowledge of what are the species that are in that city, and how do people relate to birds in that city. And it really underscores the crucial role of locals and non-professionals with intimate knowledge of the ecologies of a place to fill the gaps in formal and professional ecological knowledge and practices, to help to increase local participation and local lived knowledge while respecting the spirit of a place. So these murals are really intended to celebrate the birds that are found in New York City, and that's really to celebrate the spirit of New York City, because you can imagine, what did New York City look like before the settlement? Manhattan was a very rich and lush, very biodiverse island, because it's surrounded by so many rivers, and it connects to the Atlantic Ocean. If you can think of what the birds' experience of that land was like 500 years ago, before European arrival, then you can think a lot of what the potential is if we were to make different choices of, could we make it a safe place for birds again. So a critically important area for change in rewilding our cities are our local zoning laws. I'm just going to skip ahead here, which regulate land use. So let me say that again. So local laws are usually passed as changes to the local zoning code or bylaws. I think Massachusetts has bylaws. And so your local government is the one who makes decisions about land use. That includes like what buildings, where does a park go, where do we put the road? Those are all decisions made at the local level. And so because of that, local governments have a really important role to play in making land use decisions that are bird friendly. And local advocates and leaders are uniquely positioned to exert control over local land use and development practices towards bird-friendly practices. And they're really a way to operationalize our ethics. At the same time, research on public beliefs and attitudes about wildlife conservation show that cities are also very unique places because they tend to have higher concentrations of people who believe in mutuality between humans and wildlife. And this research has been ongoing since at least the 1980s, 1990s, showing that people, this is kind of a weird paradox, but people living in cities actually think that wildlife are like humans and therefore should be afforded the same kinds of privileges and rights of humans. And more so than in rural spaces. And there's this real, and basically it boils down to two ways that it's kind of a simplification in one way, but the research really points to two main ways that humans orient towards nature. And one is of domination, where wildlife is subordinate to humans, wildlife are to be used for human benefit. And then they care about the economy, they care about human interests, they care about private property rights, as opposed to people who believe in mutualism, that wildlife should have rights like humans, wildlife are part of one's social community, like I talked about Aldo Leopold and his concept of the land community, and that they care about wildlife population declines, they care about habitat protection and natural conditions. But weirdly, like I just said, the highest numbers of people who have this mutualist attitude towards nature are to be found in cities. Which when I first started reading the literature on this was very shocking to me in a way. But in a way, maybe it's not. You can probably think through like why would it be that maybe people in cities would have a different kind of an attitude towards wildlife? They're not in competition with them, or there's different kinds of threats there. The literature also shows that when it comes to endangered species, which I think of some of you might have had, one of you had an endangered species, that mutualists are willing to make development trade-offs and to forego some of their own preferences to save species from extinction. And this dates back to the 1990s, this research. And these are deeply embedded values. These are not like I had this idea one month and the next month I'm going to have a different orientation towards nature. These are deeply seated beliefs that do not really change over a person's lifetime. It's only intergenerational changes. It will take a whole generation to change this orientation. But as I said before, mutualists are most often found in urban areas, but not exclusively. And I would guess that many of you have this mutualist orientation. Here in this room. I would also wager that most of the cities that have bird-friendly building laws, and there are quite a few, that cities that are doing a good job of making space for wildlife, that they have a high percentage of people who have this mutualist orientation. The trouble is that right now, the right of cities to set their own regulations, so I talked before about how local governments have the right through their zoning codes to set their own preferences about what they want their buildings to look like, what they want their street to look like. But the right of cities to set their own regulations on buildings and development to protect wildlife, and in particular bird life, is being hampered and challenged by authorities on higher jurisdictions right now, at the state and even the national level. So unfortunately, last year in Canada, the province of Ontario passed a law that overturned all of the green building zoning codes that had been passed by different cities and different municipalities within the province. So that included Toronto's green standard that had the world's first bird-friendly building standard. So that just got overturned when the state decided that they didn't want to have additional restrictions on building. And a similar sort of thing happened in Madison, Wisconsin a few years ago, where a local a public law interest firm, they sued the city of Madison saying that they shouldn't be allowed to put regulations for bird-friendly building laws because it was too onerous or too expensive. And they took the city to court, saying that it went too far and put too many rules in addition to the state building code. But amazingly, that law survived the court challenge, and so Madison, Wisconsin remains a city with a bird-friendly building law. But these kinds of battles routinely pit two coalitions against each other, and you can probably guess what the two coalitions are that are being pitted against each other. The first is development groups and environmental groups, and that tension is between economic interests, these economy and private property rights, and then the environmental conservationists. It's sort of, that seems to be the way that these conflicts about how we want to use the land are being played out with these two groups. But there is also literature, mostly in the political theory realm, that suggests that actually when people, because there's quite a few people who have this mutualist orientation, in fact, the majority of people in urban areas have this mutualist orientation, and that when open democratic processes allow for people to express their preference for more protective laws for nature, that when political systems are open and participatory for members of the public, that they can destabilize these powerful policy monopolies like that real estate developers or others could, and then they can actually lead to very dramatic policy changes. This is especially true when advocates make an emotional appeal around wildlife. It can be very convincing, and they can actually get these kinds of laws passed that protect wildlife in urban spaces. So the argument right now is that, mutualist value coexistence. This is what recent research is really focusing on, is this idea of the plural valuation of nature, is that there isn't just one way that we orient towards nature. Different people have different ways, whether that is religious, whether that is commercial, they want to exploit animals, or they want to protect them, is that there's a wide variety, and that we can't just have one monistic way that we define our relationship to wildlife that informs all of our decision making, which has been happening over the last 100, 200, 300 years, is that over and over again, it's only the domination, of this it's the domination orientation that has been guiding decision making, and we really need to appreciate that a large majority of people actually have different kinds of orientations to nature, and that when we consider the perspectives, values, and attitudes of all stakeholders, including the mutualists, that actually it's a more democratic process and we actually get better outcomes for the natural world and for wildlife. So I'm developing in my policy research a concept that, this is my hypothesis, that you have two basic conditions that you need for bird-friendly building planning to happen in a city. And the first is where those environmental dominance orientation scores suggest high rates of a belief in mutualism, and also where political processes promote high rates of public participation. This means we have democracy, we have very robust democratic systems where people can express their values and participate, and also where they also believe in more mutuality with bird life and with wildlife. So you need to have both, and then those are kind of like at least the two important conditions that you have to have bird-friendly building policy making. And then I just want to talk about one last topic, which is that we really have to at the same time look at the city very holistically, is that we have to remember that it's connected geographically, materially, and legally with other jurisdictions and layers of government. So you can't just think of cities independently when you think about if you want to make them more bird-friendly or more wildlife-friendly. I mean, it starts at the local level with a lot of the land use rules, but you have to remember that cities are connected with a huge range of, different kinds of layers of government, and also different kinds of other communities. And you have to almost think of it as a whole ecosystem. And it's also important to think that way because birds themselves, a majority of our birds are migratory. I think it's about 60 to 70% of all birds in North America are migratory. So they're flying through these urban areas. They're moving from a rural area to a less rural, and then suddenly they come across these very densely populated places, and they have to fly through them safely. Even though there's all this glass, there's a lot of light pollution that affects them. There's a lot of pesticide use. There's a lot of cat predation and things. So the birds are transiting geographically across the landscape, and laws also matter across the landscape because meaningful and effective federal and international environmental laws can also protect birds in urban spaces and in other places, and they have an important role to play. Our national laws and international laws to protect birds also make our local places safer for birds. And I'll just give a quick example, which is the peregrine falcon. Now, the peregrine falcon was endemic to all of the US, except that you may have heard about DDT. Who's ever heard of DDT? Has anyone here ever read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring? So DDT was a pesticide, a very strong pesticide that they were using to basically control mosquito populations. But the problem was that it had a secondary effect, just as I was talking before about the indirect unintended consequences, is that it caused bird shells to be very brittle and fragile. And so birds, when they would nest, their eggs would break and destroy. So peregrine falcons and other birds populations diminished rapidly, and then Rachel Carson wrote her famous book, Silent Spring, because the bird populations were disappearing. Well, once the US banned DDT, I think it was in the 1980s, then suddenly you have a resurgence of birds coming back into places where for generations no one had seen one before. So now you can find a peregrine falcon. They're in Chicago, they're in Boston, they're in New York City. They like cliffs, and they really like really tall buildings and communications towers. So suddenly now, peregrine falcons are part of the urban landscape again in this generation, and that's thanks to a national level law, which was the DDT ban. So it was a national level law that made the city rewilded with birds, at least with peregrine falcons and other birds that had been affected by DDT. And so that's important for us to think a little bit more broadly. It's not just the local laws that are important, it's also national laws. So I'm just going to wrap up here by saying that there are lots of opportunities for changes in the way that we make decisions about human-settled areas and whether or not we want to share our spaces with wildlife, and I mean safely. Safely for them, safely for us. Do we want to have places that are quiet, diminished landscapes, or do we want to have living places full of life? And so that's really a decision that we have to make, and that should be baked into all decisions that we make about buildings, about planning, about where we put a road, whatever changes we make to the land is. We have to remember that birds are an important part of the ecosystem. They're important to us for all the reasons I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, but that because they make for beautiful landscapes that are really places where they can thrive and also where we can thrive. So the question before us is not simply whether we want to save birds, but what kind of communities do we want to inhabit? Do we accept landscapes that are empty and biologically diminished, or do we choose places alive with birdsong and with connection? And so if we want stronger, more resilient, and even more democratic, meaningful human communities, then considering birds as part of our development and planning process is not optional, it is indispensable. So I hope, I covered a lot of ground there, but I hope that the point was clear, is that really what's at stake here is no less than whether or not our own values, as people who care about wildlife, is will our own values and our own ideas about how the land should be used, will they be reflected in our local zoning and in the way that the land is being used, or will we only have one orientation towards nature, which is one of domination and exploitation?